have this population of people who are terrified and have suffered such deep loss, right, at the end of World War II. Some of them come into Palestine. Like, can you talk a little bit about how that went down and, you know, what happened leading up to the establishment of the State of Israel on stolen Palestinian land?
So there's a misconception about what happened in that period. And people always say, how could people that have suffered this do this? Okay? It's not the same people. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not go to Palestine. Less than 10%, very, very small percentage of people who survived the genocide of the Jews in World War II went to Palestine, and many of them left. They couldn't stand it. I was just, there's a movie that I just co-produced with a friend of mine. We interviewed a wonderful activist, Holocaust survivor, by the name of Jacques Boud, who lives in Brussels. It's a 12-minute documentary. It's actually been accepted to a couple of movie festivals. And I'll just tell you his story briefly because it speaks to that. So his parents were taken to Auschwitz and killed. He was saved by Belgians. And then after the war, survivor Jewish children were put in orphans. And the orphans were all sent, as soon as the state of the Zionist state was established, they were sent there. And he was, I don't know, 17, something like that. And he didn't want to go. He said, I want to go home. I want to stay with the people who saved me. And he couldn't because he was under 18. He had to go. So he arrived and he stayed just a couple of years. And he hated every second of it. And he describes it much better than I possibly could. But basically, he says, number one, he was this. He describes the cities, Jaffa, Ascalon, all these places that were emptied as ghost towns. And we rarely hear from people about that. Those early years before these cities were settled again by Zionist immigrants. The city were got ghost towns. And then he wanted to leave, but he couldn't leave because he didn't have papers, and he couldn't get papers unless he served in the military, and he would not serve in the military for anything in the world. He says this militant state was mad. So he got a job as a guard in an orchard near Ascalon. And you know, the southern coast of Palestine was famous for citrus orchards. The fragrance of citrus in that part of the country is always intoxicating. And he said, I was 17. They gave me a gun with live ammunition, with the expectation that if an Arab, because Israel, the name Palestinian was not acceptable, right? If an Arab comes to get an orange, he should shoot and kill him for taking an orange that initially probably belonged to them anyway, because Palestinians would come in from time to time and to get food, to get whatever, and the order was they should be shot on sight. Any Palestinian that comes back should be killed on sight. So he goes, they give me a 17-year-old a gun with ammunition telling me it's okay for me to kill a person because they wanted to take an orange, which again was theirs to begin with. And you know, he just he describes this reality, and what he did was he managed to get some money, get papers. He paid somebody to forge papers, and he got the hell out. And he's been a pro-Palestine activist, anti-Zionist activist his entire life. So this idea that somehow these are the same Jews is not true. Like again, very few Holocaust survivors actually went to Palestine, and many of them that came left, not only because they were disgusted by the militaristic state, but also because of the way they were treated, because the Zionists looked down at them. One of the first things Jacques told me when I met him was how the Zionists would look at him like the ones who were already there, at the Holocaust survivors, for being like dust, for like being worthless. Because they were led like sheep to the slaughter, sort of thing. They didn't fight. They weren't Zionists, and they didn't, And I remember learning this too, growing up. Had they been Zionists, had they come to, to Palestine, this wouldn't have happened to them. So in a way, they had it coming. This is how deeply racist and insane Zionist ideology is. Just think about that. So and he also says, he says, I can't believe, he says, it's offensive to me to think that they justify this racism, violence against Palestinians because he says, but the death of my parents, which is of course, unthinkable. So that's I think that's the answer to that question, that equation.
And so when you were raised, were you told like there weren't really like a lot of Palestinians here? Like what was the story? What was the narrative to justify coming onto this land and just taking up residence?
Well, that's an interesting story because in my case, there's a little twist. So yes, I mean, it's not a question whether they were here or not. It's a question that, it's ours. We were here 2,000 years ago and now we're back. And the casualness of the way this is told to a child is, when you think about it now, yeah, we were here 2,000 years ago and now we're back. I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? So, and I look at the color of my skin and there's not a Semitic, gene in my entire DNA, right?
I wasn't going to say it.
So you don't need to say it. It's obvious. So somehow the assumption that Jews around the world, all around the world, are the descendants of an ancient tribe that used to live in Palestine 3,000 years ago. And now, because of that, they have a right to come back, displace Palestinians, and take over their country violently. The fact that this is even something that people talk about, again, seriously, is absolutely crazy. I mean, it's discussed in such a casual manner as though it makes perfect sense. But yeah, but of course, this is our country and we're back. But that's the narrative. Yeah. That's the story. And then we were told that, the Arabs were told by their leaders to leave. That whole myth about that.
Well, they chose to leave, right?
And so now the twist in my story is this, and this is something that I realized that came back to me as I was writing the book, which is now more than 10 years ago. So I remember my entire life a story that my mother told me. My mother was born and raised in Jerusalem. And in 1948, she was 22. She was already a mother. And when the Zionist forces came in and forced the Palestinians out of West Jerusalem, so some of you may know this, but in West Jerusalem, there are these incredibly beautiful Palestinian neighborhoods. And most of them are still there. Imagine beautiful homes. These homes were offered to people like my mother, and she was offered one of these beautiful homes. Now, she was living in a tiny apartment with her parents and young children. And she refused. She said, how could I possibly move into the home of another family, of another mother, who are now refugees? And she talked about it my entire life. She told the story so many times with so much pain. And then how the homes were looted. They had trucks and they came with trucks and they stole everything. So that doesn't make sense because that's not the narrative. That's not the story that I know. The story that I know is they attacked us and then they left because we won or something, some kind of distorted version of that. But we being the ones kicking people out and stealing, how does that fit into this perfect little narrative? It didn't. Yeah. But eventually, I think it was a crack in that wall that helped me when I started coming, when I would hear, like, for example, George Khoury talk about his version growing up in Jerusalem and what happened to his family. And others, suddenly there was a space there for me to understand that, oh, wait a minute, that relates to what my mother told me. So I heard it, if you will, from both ends, from both sides. But that was the story that I was told, and that's the story that we all believe, of course.
I think for people who are born and raised outside of Palestine or Israel, and like me, raised in the US, when I try to understand what does it really mean to live in an apartheid Palestine, And the analogy that comes up for me growing up in the South here is the Jim Crow South, right? It was just widely, and it still exists, frankly, but like, it's just widely accepted that this is the way things are. Were there things that you saw or heard of that you were just kind of like, oh yeah, like that's just how it is? And then I guess the follow-up to that is, can you share some examples of what it means for Palestinians to live in an apartheid state? Like tangible, what is it like for them day to day?
So, I grew up in Jerusalem, and it's a completely segregated racist city. So I could tell now two things. Number one, we don't go into their neighborhoods because it's dangerous. But from time to time, we might drive through or we see them, you could see that there's a difference. Their schools don't look like ours. Their streets don't look like ours. They don't have sidewalks and playgrounds and running water. And there's like, it's a completely, you can tell it's, one side looks modern and like this, and the other side kind of looks dusty and backward.
Yeah.
And the backstory is, well, of course they're backward because they're Arabs. We came as Europeans and we're more advanced and we're smarter and we are hardworking. And so look what we did. And then, look at them. And this is happening even today when you drive up and down the country through Palestine, you see on the Israeli settlements look like modern cities. The Palestinian towns look like they're backward. And the assumption even today is always, well, what do you expect? I mean, obviously these are Europeans and so they're advanced, and these are Arabs and so they're backward. The fact that, for example, and this goes to the second part of your question, Palestinians, well, let me backtrack. So let's talk about water for a second, because I think that's a big part of the apartheid and how it impacts Palestinians. So the state of Israel has its own agency that deals with all the water, controls all the water. It's called Mikorot. So they control all the water. They allocate 3% of the water, 3% of the water to the Palestinian population. Now, throughout Palestine, and again, just to be clear, when I say Palestine, I don't mean little bits and pieces of Palestine. I mean, Palestine, all of it. Throughout Palestine, today there's about 7.5 million Palestinians, about 6 or 6.5 million Israelis, okay? Palestinians receive about 3% of the water. Now, it's a small country, relatively speaking, and the Palestinian neighborhoods and cities are sometimes just across the street from each other. Across the street. Like you'll have an Israeli settlement here, and you'll have a Palestinian town here across the street. How the level of sophistication you have to have in the water distribution so that one side gets all the water they need as much as they want, whenever they want it. I mean, I never had to think twice about opening the faucet or watering the lawn or drinking or anything, ever. On the other side, they're lucky if they get 7, 8, 10 hours of running water a week. A week. So that part of the story is not known. Now, think about that, the difference that the town, what the towns look like, what it changes everything, right? If you have that little water on this one side and you have all the abundance of water that you possibly want. So you see this, as a kid, you don't know the word apartheid. I didn't know the word apartheid, but I could see that there was a difference. And I remember asking, why do they look like this? And why are there towns like this? And, why is there such a big difference? And the answer was always like a shrug. Well, that's how it is, because it's just Arabs. They're kind of, until later on, that kind of shifted. Even in my family, that conversation shifted a little bit. But that's what you see, and that's what you comprehend. And what you don't know, again, is the water issue.
Yeah.
And until you visit Palestinian homes, it doesn't matter where. It doesn't matter where. Anywhere throughout Palestine, you see the water issue. It's one of the most glaring differences that you notice.
Yeah. I'm going to give you an open-ended question. I want to hear your thoughts on October 7th and what's unfolded since then.
Sure.
And how we got there, which we've talked a little bit about.
How we got to October 7th is, almost 8 decades of oppression. I mean, That's how we got there, of apartheid and genocide. That's how we got there. I don't think there was anything surprising in the fact that, what happened on October 7th happened on October 7th. And maybe we should talk about the Gaza Strip for a little bit. People discuss the Gaza Strip and the West Bank as though these are like countries or something, as though these are like real areas that have a history. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip were drawn by the Zionist state as prisons, especially the Gaza Strip, as a prison. It's a prison that's been in place for more than 7 decades, the Gaza Strip, and it was created as a place to herd in hundreds of thousands of refugees from mostly southern Palestine. That's why there's a strong connection between the Palestinians in southern Palestine and Naqab and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, because they all come from the same place. That's what the Gaza Strip is. It's a prison. And I'll jump forward a little bit to the end of the story. People talk about, well, who's going to control the Gaza Strip next? The Gaza Strip needs to be dismantled. It's a prison. It's a prison. It needs to be completely disappear. Over 2 million people live in the Gaza Strip should have the right to go. If you drive from any place in this thing called the Gaza Strip east for 5-10 minutes, there's all the water, all the food, all the electricity, everything you need. Hospitals, medical care. There's no reason on the face of the earth, not a single justification for the people in the Gaza Strip to lack anything. To lack anything other than they are in a prison and they are prevented from getting these things. And this crazy notion that aid needs to be sent through Egypt, and God knows how many trucks are waiting for approval of who? The Zionist state, to allow the aid to come in. Open the damn gates, dismantle this stupid thing, and let people go and buy what they need to buy and get what they need to get. But everybody's accustomed to, Gaza, West Bank, Gaza. People won't even say Palestine anymore. They say West Bank. I'm going to stop saying West Bank. First of all, the West Bank really doesn't exist. These are just literally concentration camps where 3.5 million people live in these areas surrounded by cities and towns for Jews only. That's really what the West Bank became. There is no such thing as the West Bank anymore. And that's just these 2 areas. Now there's the lion's share of Palestine, 1948 Palestine, where Palestinians live again under horrific conditions, even though they carry this citizenship. They're citizens of the Zionist state. So what led up to this? That's what led up to it. Almost 8 decades of horror. Now, the way it's interesting. I know we talked about Mondoweiss. So I write from time to time, and I sent them an article on October the 6th. And I woke up October 7th and I had an email from the editor saying, could you update your article based on what happened? And I thought, what happened? So of course I look up and I see what happened. So then and that was the last thing I wrote. I couldn't write until a few weeks ago. I couldn't write. I just couldn't write. It was. And that was the last thing I wrote for a very long time. But immediately my response was this heroic operation by fighters who come out of one of the most oppressed and impoverished areas in the world. And as we all know, they came by gliders, they came by foot, and they came through, with boats. And they completely paralyzed the Zionist state. Completely paralyzed. They came from a place where a cup of water like this is a luxury. Well, this is a luxury. A cup of clean water is a luxury. 3 meals a day are a luxury. Antibiotic, if you have a child that has an ear infection, is a luxury. And they came out from there and they were able to completely shut down. And in many ways, the Zionist state is still shut down. The southern port of Eilat is shut down. The economy is in chaos. The political structure is in chaos. I mean, and on and on and on. They really managed to do what many have tried and failed to do, which is to shut it down. It was brilliantly executed. I think it was obvious to anybody who knows anything that the Palestinians are going to pay a heavy price, beyond a heavy price, because this monster of a war machine, which is the Zionist state, was humiliated beyond words. They were humiliated before, by the way. Every single time they were surprised, they were humiliated. And by the way, this happened exactly 50 years and 1 day after the beginning of the October 1973 war, where two Arab armies surprised the state of Israel, the Syrians and the Egyptians, and they were not able to do what the Palestinians in Gaza did, but they humiliated the entire apparatus. Defense apparatus was in panic in 1973. I still remember it as a kid, and so they. And then the interesting thing is, immediately, of course, the Zionist state came out with all these horrific lies, all these horrific stories about rape and murder and God knows what else. And I couldn't write, but I was posting a lot of stuff, and my response to that was, first of all, we need to find out what happened. We need to see some kind of an independent investigation, because none of these claims make sense. Number one, these were disciplined Palestinian fighters. It doesn't make sense that any of that other stuff would have happened. Number two, the declared objective of the operation was to capture prisoners and conduct a prisoner exchange, to release Palestinian prisoners. Why would they do all this other stuff? None of it made any sense, And again, disciplined fighters don't do these things. So none of it made sense, and of course, it turned out that these were all lies, which is, of course, no surprise.
But our government still repeats.
But it's still, these lies are still being repeated, of course, because they have to maintain this narrative. So then you had this monster, this humiliated monster, unleash its vengeance. And when you're a bully, where do you unleash your vengeance? On the most defenseless victim you can find. And these are the people who live in the Gaza Strip. And that's what we've seen, this sadistic brutality that we've seen over the last 11 months. That's what this is. It's this humiliated monster unleashing its vengeance. That's really all it is. So that's been my response, and that's been and I'll say one more thing as a result of this. Another thing that came out as a result of this is what we've seen on campuses, this rebellion on campuses. Now, I've been saying this, for a very long time. The most important work for Palestine in this country is being done by student groups on campuses. Nobody's raised the level of conversation of Palestine like students on campuses have. No one. Absolutely. And anything anybody who's no longer in college can do to support them, go and do it. Whatever the local college is closest to you, find the MSA, find the SJP, now there's Palestine Youth Movement, go and support them, because they need all the help they can get. The administration wants to get rid of them, and you saw how they're all being punished for standing up for what is right. And first of all, their actions were nothing short of heroic. Yeah. And I've been, honored to visit some of these encampments, some of these liberated zones, and it was just inspiring. On the one hand, you see this just lack of humanity, the worst lack of humanity, the worst, expression of inhumanity we can possibly imagine. And on these campuses, the most beautiful expression of humanity you can imagine. It was incredible. And what's beautiful about that is their demands, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, were completely unapologetically honest. They demanded to divest, which is exactly what you're supposed to do when the crime of apartheid is taking place and the crime of genocide is taking place, is to divest, and they demanded. And they demanded a free Palestine from the river to the sea. And when they were reprimanded and told, well, you shouldn't say river to the sea, you shouldn't say Palestine, it might offend anyone, they took the mic and they said it even louder. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In other words, this level of unapologetic expression of a demand for justice is it's inspiring. And in a way, there are parallels, I think, between that and what we see the fighters from Gaza did. They went against all odds. They're going against the known narrative, and unapologetically, they're demanding what they deserve.
That's right. I think this is a good time to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll do Q&A. So if anyone needs to use the restroom, it's this way. It's an all-gender restroom. It'll be on your left through the double doors. We'll come back at 5:22 on this clock and resume with questions.